In the years immediately following Joseph Stalin's death, Western intelligence services confronted a problem that was less about access than interpretation, because while information about Soviet leadership changes, policy shifts, and rhetorical signals was increasingly available through open sources, diplomatic reporting, and limited clandestine collection, the conceptual frameworks used to analyze that information were shaped by assumptions forged during the Stalin era, assumptions that proved poorly suited to understanding the dynamics of de-Stalinization under Nikita Khrushchev. And this mismatch between data and interpretation produced a series of intelligence failures that distorted Western assessments of Soviet intentions, stability, and risk. At the core of this failure was the persistence of an analytical model that treated the Soviet system as a rigid, monolithic structure, whose behavior could be inferred from ideological consistency and centralized control, a model reinforced by decades of Stalinist practice, but increasingly misaligned with the more fluid, contested, and improvisational politics that emerged in the mid-1950s as Khrushchev consolidated power and selectively dismantled elements of the terror system while preserving the fundamental authority of the Communist Party. Western intelligence analysts initially struggled to reconcile contradictory signals, such as the denunciation of Stalin's cult of personality, the release of prisoners, and changes in cultural policy, with continued repression, military expansion, and assertive foreign policy behavior, and this tension produced interpretive oscillation rather than coherent reassessment, with some assessments overstating the depth of reform, while others dismissed de-Stalinization as purely cosmetic. The intelligence challenge was compounded by the secrecy surrounding internal Soviet debates, because while public speeches, party resolutions, and policy announcements provided clues, they did not reveal the balance of power within the leadership or the strategic calculations driving reform, leading analysts to project intentions onto incomplete evidence. A critical moment in this misreading occurred with Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in 1956, which Western intelligence agencies quickly recognized as a significant ideological rupture, but struggled to contextualize, interpreting it alternately as a sign of systemic liberalization, a tactical maneuver to consolidate power, or a prelude to instability, without fully grasping that it could function simultaneously as all three within the Soviet political logic. This ambiguity exposed a deeper analytical weakness, namely the tendency to interpret Soviet behavior through binary categories of aggression versus accommodation, rigidity versus reform, rather than as a spectrum of adaptive strategies employed to manage internal legitimacy and external pressure. And this tendency led to exaggerated expectations that de-Stalinization would either dramatically soften Soviet foreign policy or trigger internal collapse, neither of which occurred. Western intelligence reporting from this period reveals repeated misinterpretation of signaling, particularly in diplomatic and military domains, where conciliatory rhetoric was often read as evidence of reduced risk, even as Soviet force posture and alliance commitments remained unchanged, creating false confidence in stability during moments of genuine uncertainty. The Hungarian uprising of 1956 crystallized these failures, as intelligence services underestimated both the depth of popular expectations generated by de-Stalinization and the likelihood that the Soviet leadership would resort to force to reassert control, misreading Khrushchev's reformist posture as a constraint on coercion rather than as a recalibration of how and when coercion would be applied. This miscalculation reflected an analytical blind spot regarding the limits of reform within authoritarian systems, where partial liberalization can increase volatility without reducing the regime's willingness to use force, a dynamic that Western intelligence had insufficiently theorized at the time. Throughout the late 1950s, similar interpretive errors persisted as intelligence assessments struggled to differentiate between genuine strategic signaling and internal political messaging intended for domestic audiences, particularly in areas such as arms control proposals, summit diplomacy, and public appeals for peaceful coexistence, leading to cycles of optimism and disillusionment that undermined consistent policy planning. These failures were not the result of ignorance, but of methodological inertia, as analysts continued to privilege ideological texts and leadership statements without fully integrating organizational behavior, bureaucratic competition, and leadership psychology into their models, leaving them ill-equipped to assess a Soviet system undergoing managed change rather than linear transformation. By the early 1960s, as Khrushchev's leadership became more erratic and policy experimentation intensified, Western intelligence began to recognize that its earlier assumptions had constrained understanding, but the damage had already been done in the form of misaligned expectations and policy missteps rooted in the initial misreading of de-Stalinization, demonstrating that the intelligence failure lay not in the absence of signals, but in the inability to interpret them within a framework attuned to adaptive authoritarian behavior rather than static totalitarian control. In the months after Khrushchev's secret speech became known in the West, the central interpretive failure hardened into a practical intelligence problem because Western services treated the denunciation of Stalin as a single directional signal, pointing towards systemic liberalization, when in reality it was also an internal power instrument and a controlled recalibration of legitimacy designed to strengthen the party's authority after terror had corroded governance. And this confusion bled directly into estimates of Soviet thresholds, especially in Eastern Europe, where analysts underestimated how quickly de-Stalinization would raise popular expectations while simultaneously overestimating how much it would restrain Moscow's willingness to use force. In early 1956, intelligence reporting captured rising ferment in the satellites through labor unrest indicators, party faction disputes, and increasingly open criticism of Stalinist officials. Yet, the prevailing analytical lens interpreted these as manageable symptoms of reform, rather than as destabilizing consequences of partial liberalization. And this bias shaped assessments that framed Soviet policy as moving toward normalization, rather than as entering a volatile transition phase in which the leadership had not yet defined clear limits, a phase in which mixed signals were inevitable because the Kremlin itself was experimenting. The Polish crisis of 1956 exposed the problem in a controlled form, as Western intelligence struggled to interpret whether Moscow's tolerance of a leadership change and limited autonomy in Warsaw reflected a new doctrine of flexibility or a tactical concession forced by constraints. And because analysts lacked reliable penetration of Kremlin deliberations, they defaulted to reading the outcome as evidence of a softened Soviet approach, underweighting the role of coercive readiness and overemphasizing rhetorical shifts, a pattern that then distorted expectations for Hungary, where the intelligence community observed mounting unrest, but failed to reconcile it with the likelihood of a violent Soviet response. In Hungary, the misreading was not merely predictive failure, but a conceptual one, rooted in the assumption that reform rhetoric implied an aversion to escalation, when in fact, reform and repression were not opposites in Soviet practice, but tools selected according to perceived risk to bloc integrity, and the Soviet leadership's willingness to crush the Hungarian uprising demonstrated that de-Stalinization was not a surrender of coercion, but an attempt to re-legitimate coercion under a different narrative, an outcome Western intelligence did not anticipate with sufficient clarity, because it had not built an analytic model in which partial liberalization could generate instability that the regime would then resolve through force. This failure was compounded by the way signals were processed, because public Soviet messaging about peaceful coexistence and critique of Stalin was weighted heavily in estimates, while the operational indicators of coercive capacity, troop positioning, command readiness, and the institutional imperative to prevent bloc unraveling were treated as background constants rather than decisive variables, producing estimates that leaned toward optimism in moments, when the objective structure of Soviet interests made violence plausible. In the aftermath of Hungary, Western intelligence swung toward the opposite error, overcorrecting by treating the crackdown as proof that de-Stalinization was fraudulent, thereby missing the more complicated reality that Khrushchev's reforms were real in limited domains, yet always subordinate to party monopoly. And this oscillation created instability in policy guidance, as estimates alternated between expectations of moderation and expectations of renewed terror, neither of which captured the emergent Soviet pattern of controlled reform paired with selective repression. Through 1957 and 1958, additional misreadings accumulated as Khrushchev used public initiatives, summit proposals, and dramatic rhetoric to shape the international environment while managing internal consolidation. And Western analysts repeatedly struggled to distinguish external signaling designed to influence Western opinion from internal messaging aimed at party constituencies and bureaucratic rivals, a distinction made harder by the fact that Khrushchev often used the same language for both audiences, collapsing propaganda and policy into a single performative style that was novel after Stalin's more rigid messaging. The intelligence service's methodological inertia also manifested in personnel and process, as analytic units trained to read Soviet politics as static and doctrinal faced difficulty incorporating leadership psychology, bureaucratic competition, and improvisation, leading to mirror imaging in which analysts assumed that dramatic statements implied fixed policy commitments, when in Khrushchev's case, dramatic statements frequently functioned as probes, bargaining positions, or domestic legitimacy performances, rather than as binding promises. This misinterpretation was visible in assessments of Soviet diplomacy and arms control gestures, where proposals for negotiation were often read as indicators of constraint or peaceful intent without sufficient integration of Soviet strategic objectives, including the desire to secure recognition of post-war borders and to manage the German question on terms favorable to Moscow, objectives that could be pursued through negotiation and pressure simultaneously. The Berlin issue became a recurring example of how interpretive failure could persist even with abundant signals, as Soviet threats and deadlines were sometimes dismissed as bluster rooted in propaganda needs, while at other times they were treated as imminent preludes to military action. And in both cases, the core Soviet strategy, using controlled crisis to force diplomatic movement while avoiding full-scale war, was not consistently modeled, resulting in intelligence products that either underestimated the risk of escalation or overstated Soviet intent to initiate direct conflict. Technological and symbolic shocks, such as Sputnik, further complicated interpretation by reinforcing the tendency to treat Soviet actions as coherent manifestations of centrally planned strategy, strengthening the old monolithic model at precisely the moment when Soviet policymaking was becoming more contested and experimental. And thus, even when analysts correctly recognized Soviet advances, they often inferred a degree of centralized mastery that obscured internal frictions, leading to inflated assessments of Soviet capacity for sustained strategic execution and misjudgments about how quickly Soviet leaders could translate technological achievements into stable political advantage. Across these episodes, the central failure remained consistent: Western intelligence was collecting signals, but sorting them through an inherited conceptual framework that expected either rigid continuity or linear liberalization, leaving it poorly equipped to interpret a Soviet system entering a phase of managed change where contradictory signals were not anomalies but the normal output of a leadership. Balancing reform, legitimacy, coercion, and international competition. And by the end of the 1950s, this misreading had produced a pattern of reactive estimation in which intelligence products lagged behind Soviet behavior, oscillated in confidence, and repeatedly forced policymakers to adjust to surprises that, in retrospect, were signaled but misinterpreted. By the time Khrushchev's leadership entered its most volatile phase in the early 1960s, the accumulated misinterpretation of his signaling had hardened into a structural weakness in Western intelligence analysis. Because earlier failures had produced a feedback loop in which contradictory Soviet behavior was increasingly interpreted through pre-existing narratives rather than prompting revision of underlying assumptions. And this loop shaped how subsequent crises were understood before they fully unfolded. Intelligence assessments approaching this period often treated Khrushchev's initiatives as either bluff or breakthrough, leaving little analytic space for the possibility that controlled risk-taking itself was a deliberate governing strategy designed to compensate for Soviet economic limitations, internal factionalism, and the need to demonstrate leadership vitality after de-Stalinization had removed terror as the primary mechanism of authority. This interpretive gap was especially evident in the handling of Berlin, where successive Soviet ultimatums were alternately discounted as propaganda and elevated as imminent war warnings, without a consistent model explaining why Khrushchev would repeatedly escalate rhetorically while avoiding decisive military action, a pattern that made sense within a framework of calibrated pressure, but appeared incoherent within binary models of aggression versus accommodation. Western intelligence reporting tracked troop movements, diplomatic exchanges, and internal debates among allies, yet struggled to integrate these indicators into a unified estimate of Soviet intent, producing assessments that emphasized uncertainty rather than structured risk. And this ambiguity complicated policymaking by forcing leaders to prepare simultaneously for escalation and negotiation without clear prioritization. The failure to model Khrushchev's behavior as adaptive rather than erratic also distorted assessments of Soviet alliance management, as analysts underestimated the degree to which de-Stalinization had loosened control over the Eastern Bloc, while simultaneously increasing the leadership's sensitivity to perceived threats to cohesion, leading to surprise when Moscow alternated between tolerance and force depending on context. This dynamic was visible not only in Eastern Europe, but in relations with China, where ideological disputes and policy divergence created signals that Western intelligence initially misread as temporary disagreements rather than as indicators of a deeper fracture, reflecting the persistence of a monolithic Soviet bloc assumption that de-Stalinization had already undermined but not displaced. The Cuban Missile Crisis would later crystallize these analytic shortcomings, as Western intelligence succeeded in identifying the physical presence of Soviet missiles, yet initially struggled to interpret the political rationale behind their deployment, oscillating between explanations rooted in strategic parity, defensive deterrence, and impulsive risk-taking, without fully integrating Khrushchev's pattern of using dramatic moves to alter bargaining positions under conditions of perceived disadvantage. While the crisis ultimately forced rapid reassessment and adaptation, it also exposed how earlier misreadings of Khrushchev's signaling had limited the ability to anticipate such behavior as part of a broader strategy rather than as an aberration. Organizational factors within Western intelligence agencies compounded the problem, as analytic cultures rewarded consistency and caution, making it difficult for unconventional interpretations to displace established views, and as coordination between political, military, and psychological analysis remained uneven, preventing the emergence of a holistic model of Soviet decision-making that could account for both reformist rhetoric and coercive action. The methodological reliance on public statements as primary indicators persisted despite repeated evidence that Khrushchev used public messaging instrumentally, treating speeches and proposals as tools to test reactions, mobilize constituencies, and create negotiating leverage rather than as fixed commitments. And this reliance reinforced a cycle in which analysts reacted to rhetoric rather than anticipating its strategic function. By the mid-1960s, after Khrushchev's removal, Western intelligence institutions began more systematically to reflect on these failures, recognizing that the misreading of de-Stalinization had revealed deeper analytic vulnerabilities related to mirror imaging, institutional inertia, and the difficulty of interpreting adaptive authoritarian systems and postmortems increasingly emphasized that future assessments would need to incorporate leadership psychology, bureaucratic incentives, and internal legitimacy dynamics alongside traditional indicators of capability and ideology. This retrospective insight underscored that the intelligence failure behind Western misreading of Khrushchev was not confined to a single moment or decision, but represented a sustained inability to update analytical models in response to structural change, leaving intelligence products reactive rather than anticipatory during a critical period of Cold War transformation. The lesson drawn internally was that signals are only as meaningful as the frameworks used to interpret them, and that when those frameworks lag behind political reality, even abundant information can produce misunderstanding, a conclusion that would influence subsequent efforts to refine Soviet analysis, but could not undo the strategic consequences of misinterpretation during Khrushchev's tenure. As Western intelligence organizations began to internalize the lessons of misreading Khrushchev, the core realization that emerged was that de-Stalinization had altered the signaling environment without eliminating authoritarian control, creating a hybrid system that produced ambiguous, layered, and sometimes deliberately contradictory messages. And this realization exposed how deeply earlier analytic habits had been shaped by the experience of totalitarian rigidity rather than by an understanding of adaptive governance under constraint. Intelligence assessments drafted in the mid-1960s increasingly acknowledged that Khrushchev's leadership style had relied on uncertainty as a tool, using oscillation between conciliation and confrontation to keep adversaries, allies, and domestic rivals off balance. Yet this acknowledgement came too late to correct the earlier pattern in which analysts had treated inconsistency as either deception or weakness rather than as an intentional strategy. The failure to anticipate this mode of behavior had consequences beyond individual crises, because it shaped alliance management, arms control expectations, and public rhetoric in ways that alternately overstated Soviet moderation or exaggerated the imminence of conflict, creating policy volatility that intelligence was meant to reduce rather than amplify. One of the most significant institutional shortcomings revealed by this period was the underdevelopment of leadership-centric analysis within Western intelligence, as Khrushchev's personal influence, rhetorical style, and risk tolerance played an outsized role in Soviet behavior. Yet, analytic frameworks remained focused on ideological texts and aggregate indicators of capability, leaving personality and internal power dynamics underweighted in estimates. This gap mattered because de-Stalinization had weakened the predictability of collective discipline, making individual initiative more consequential, and intelligence services that failed to adjust accordingly were prone to surprise when Khrushchev pursued unconventional tactics that did not fit established patterns. The difficulty of integrating psychological and political analysis was compounded by bureaucratic compartmentalization, as insights about leadership behavior often remained siloed from military and economic assessments, preventing the synthesis necessary to model how reform rhetoric, force posture, and domestic legitimacy interacted in practice. Intelligence reporting from the late Khrushchev period also revealed an emerging awareness that Western analysts had underestimated the Soviet system's capacity for learning, assuming that reforms would either cascade into liberalization or collapse back into repression, when in reality the system adapted by selectively incorporating change while preserving core controls, a dynamic that required a more nuanced model than those available at the time. This underestimation led to repeated misjudgments about the durability of Soviet initiatives, including arms control proposals and organizational reforms, which were often interpreted as either transient ploys or irreversible commitments, rather than as contingent experiments subject to revision. The cumulative effect of these analytic limitations was a persistent lag between Soviet behavior and Western understanding, as intelligence products explained actions after the fact rather than anticipating them, a pattern that eroded confidence and forced policymakers to operate with heightened uncertainty during moments when clarity was most needed. Post-mortem analyses conducted after Khrushchev's removal increasingly emphasized that the core intelligence failure lay in the inability to update conceptual models in response to systemic change, a failure that had allowed outdated assumptions about monolithic control and linear reform to coexist, unchallenged, despite mounting contradictory evidence. These reviews also highlighted the dangers of mirror imaging, as Western analysts projected their own assumptions about political signaling and accountability onto a system in which public statements served different functions and accountability mechanisms operated through party dynamics rather than electoral pressure. By the late 1960s, these insights began to inform a gradual recalibration of Soviet analysis, with greater emphasis placed on internal politics, leadership incentives, and the interaction between domestic legitimacy and foreign policy behavior. Yet this recalibration was uneven and contested, reflecting the difficulty of institutional learning within large analytic organizations. In retrospect, the misreading of Khrushchev represented a transitional failure, occurring at the intersection of an evolving adversary and a static analytic culture, and it demonstrated that intelligence effectiveness depends not only on access to information but on the flexibility of interpretive frameworks, a lesson that would shape later Cold War analysis but was learned through costly misjudgment during one of the most consequential leadership transitions of the era. As the implications of this misreading became clearer, Western intelligence institutions increasingly confronted the uncomfortable conclusion that their failure to understand Khrushchev was not an isolated anomaly, but a symptom of deeper structural weaknesses in how political change inside authoritarian systems was analyzed, because the tools developed to interpret Stalinist rigidity proved inadequate once terror receded and improvisation entered the system. Yet those tools remained embedded in analytic training, production routines, and evaluative standards long after their explanatory power had diminished. Intelligence reviews from the late 1960s emphasized that de-Stalinization had created a political environment in which signals were intentionally multivalent, serving internal legitimacy needs, factional maneuvering, and external bargaining simultaneously, and that analysts who treated signals as unidirectional messages inevitably stripped them of context producing estimates that were precise in language but shallow in explanatory depth. This weakness was particularly evident in the assessment of Soviet intentions during diplomatic initiatives, where Western intelligence often treated proposals as reflections of constraint or goodwill, rather than as instruments designed to probe Western reactions, test alliance cohesion, and reframe negotiating baselines, leading to repeated cycles in which optimism was followed by disappointment when Soviet behavior failed to conform to inferred intent. The misinterpretation of Khrushchev's signaling also had consequences for deterrence analysis, as Western estimates alternated between overstating Soviet risk aversion and overstating Soviet recklessness, without integrating the possibility that controlled escalation could be rational within a system seeking leverage under asymmetrical conditions, a gap that complicated crisis management by obscuring the logic behind Soviet moves. Intelligence reporting from this period increasingly acknowledged that Khrushchev's leadership combined ideological conviction with pragmatic adaptation. Yet this acknowledgement often remained descriptive rather than analytic, failing to translate into predictive frameworks capable of anticipating how similar patterns might recur under different circumstances. Organizational incentives reinforced this limitation, as analysts were rewarded for cautious consensus rather than for challenging dominant narratives, making it difficult for alternative interpretations to displace established views even when evidence accumulated. And this conservatism favored continuity in analytic language over revision of underlying assumptions. The problem was exacerbated by the pace of events, as rapid developments in Berlin, arms control, and alliance politics left little time for deep conceptual reassessment, encouraging reliance on familiar categories that could be deployed quickly even if they fit poorly. By the end of Khrushchev's tenure, Western intelligence had accumulated extensive documentation of misaligned estimates and reactive adjustments. Yet the institutional capacity to learn from these experiences lagged behind recognition of the problem, resulting in reforms that were incremental rather than transformative. These reforms included greater attention to internal Soviet politics, leadership psychology, and bureaucratic competition, but they were unevenly applied and often competed with enduring ideological models that framed Soviet behavior in static terms. The enduring lesson drawn from this period was that intelligence failure can arise not from ignorance or deception, but from conceptual rigidity when analytic frameworks persist beyond the conditions that produced them. And this rigidity can be especially damaging during periods of transition when adversaries experiment with new forms of governance and signaling. The misreading of Khrushchev thus stands as a case study in how partial reform within an authoritarian system can generate more, not less, uncertainty, and how intelligence organizations that fail to adapt to this uncertainty risk becoming trapped in cycles of surprise and reinterpretation. By the early 1970s, as a new generation of analysts attempted to integrate these insights, the experience of de-Stalinization was increasingly cited as a cautionary example of how signals can be plentiful, yet misleading when filtered through outdated models, reinforcing the conclusion that effective intelligence depends as much on the ability to revise assumptions as on the capacity to collect information, a conclusion that reshaped internal debates but could not retroactively correct the strategic misjudgments produced during Khrushchev's rule. By the early 1970s, the retrospective analysis of Khrushchev-era intelligence failures had crystallized into a broader institutional reckoning about how Western intelligence services approached systemic change. Because the misreading of de-Stalinization revealed that analysts had been trained to expect stability or collapse, but not managed transformation. And this expectation bias distorted interpretation whenever an adversary altered methods without abandoning objectives. Intelligence training materials and internal critiques from this period increasingly highlighted that Khrushchev's reforms were neither a rupture nor a deception, but a recalibration designed to restore party control, improve administrative efficiency, and compete more effectively with the West under conditions of technological and economic strain. Yet, this synthesis had been unavailable in real time, because analytic categories had framed reform and repression as mutually exclusive. The recognition of this error prompted efforts to develop more dynamic models of authoritarian behavior, emphasizing that regimes could liberalize selectively, tolerate dissent temporarily, and still resort to force decisively when core interests were threatened. A pattern that de-Stalinization had exemplified, but that intelligence had failed to model until after the fact. This conceptual lag mattered because it affected not only Soviet analysis, but the interpretation of political change in other authoritarian contexts, as the Khrushchev case demonstrated how intelligence failure could arise when analysts underestimated the capacity of centralized systems to adapt without democratizing, a lesson that would later be applied unevenly to other regions. Intelligence postmortems also stressed the importance of distinguishing between signaling intended to manage domestic legitimacy and signaling aimed at external audiences, noting that Khrushchev frequently collapsed these domains, using public rhetoric to address party critics while simultaneously probing Western reactions, and that analysts who did not parse audience and purpose risked misattributing intent. The experience underscored the need for integrated analysis that combined political, psychological, military, and economic indicators rather than treating them as separate streams, because de-Stalinization altered incentives across all domains simultaneously, producing behavior that could not be understood through single variable models. Organizational reforms attempted to address these gaps by encouraging cross-disciplinary teams and by elevating dissenting views. Yet the persistence of hierarchical review processes and consensus-driven production limited the speed and depth of change, illustrating how institutional inertia can blunt lessons even when failures are acknowledged. The Khrushchev case also reinforced awareness that intelligence estimates shape policy expectations as much as they respond to them, and that misinterpretation of reformist signals can create policy volatility by swinging leaders between accommodation and confrontation, a dynamic evident in the oscillating Western responses to Soviet initiatives during the late 1950s and early 1960s. In this sense, the intelligence failure was recursive, as flawed interpretation not only misread Soviet behavior, but influenced Western actions in ways that fed back into Soviet decision-making, complicating the signaling environment further. By situating the misreading of Khrushchev within this broader feedback loop, later analysts argued that intelligence effectiveness required not only better models of adversary behavior, but also greater awareness of how intelligence products themselves shape the strategic environment, a reflexive insight that was largely absent during the period under study. The enduring significance of the Khrushchev misreading thus lay not in any single estimate or crisis, but in its demonstration that intelligence organizations can be slow to recognize when the object of analysis has changed character, and that during such transitions, even accurate data can mislead if interpreted through outdated assumptions. This realization informed subsequent efforts to refine Soviet analysis and contributed to a more cautious approach to interpreting reform signals in later decades. Yet, it also remained a reminder that intelligence failure often emerges gradually through accumulated small misinterpretations rather than dramatic blind spots, making it harder to detect and correct in real time. The legacy of de-Stalinization in Western intelligence therefore became a benchmark against which later analytic performance was measured, illustrating how conceptual rigidity can persist despite abundant evidence, and how adaptation in analysis often lags adaptation in the systems being observed, a lag that can have strategic consequences during periods of political transformation. In the final evaluation of the intelligence failure behind Western misreading of Khrushchev, the central conclusion that emerged was that the failure was systemic rather than episodic, rooted in the inability of analytic institutions to adapt their interpretive frameworks at the same pace as the political system they were observing. And this mismatch between evolving reality and static models produced a prolonged period in which signals were visible, but meaning was consistently misassigned. De-Stalinization did not remove secrecy, coercion, or strategic ambition from the Soviet system, but it altered the mechanisms through which authority was exercised and messages were conveyed, and Western intelligence, conditioned by decades of Stalinist precedent, struggled to recognize that authoritarian control could coexist with rhetorical openness, policy experimentation, and calculated risk-taking without collapsing into either liberalization or chaos. The persistence of binary assumptions, reform versus repression, peace versus aggression, continuity versus rupture, left analysts poorly equipped to interpret a leadership that deliberately blurred these categories, using contradiction as a tool to manage internal legitimacy and external leverage simultaneously. This conceptual rigidity had tangible consequences as it shaped expectations in crises, distorted assessments of risk, and contributed to cycles of surprise and recalibration that undermined confidence in intelligence products at moments when clarity was most needed. The failure also revealed how deeply institutional memory can constrain analysis, as inherited models continued to structure interpretation even as accumulating evidence challenged their validity, and how organizational incentives favored caution and consensus over conceptual innovation, delaying necessary revision. In retrospect, the misreading of Khrushchev demonstrated that intelligence effectiveness depends not only on access to information or technical collection capability, but on the capacity to revise foundational assumptions in response to change, particularly during transitional periods when adversaries experiment with new forms of governance and signaling. The lesson drawn internally was that intelligence failure often occurs not because signals are absent or deceptive, but because analysts lack frameworks capable of accommodating ambiguity, contradiction, and adaptation as normal features of political behavior, rather than as anomalies to be resolved. This realization would later inform more sophisticated approaches to Soviet analysis and to the study of authoritarian systems more broadly. Yet, it also served as a cautionary reminder that such insights are often recognized only after strategic consequences have already unfolded. The Khrushchev case thus stands as a defining example of how intelligence can misread transformation when it expects continuity or collapse, and how de-Stalinization exposed the limits of Cold War analytical orthodoxy at a moment when understanding mattered most, leaving a legacy that reshaped internal debates while underscoring the enduring challenge of interpreting power in systems that change without surrendering control.